Hello, and welcome to Around the Political World with John Rothman. I am your host, John Rothman. If you're a fan of the show, make sure to hit the follow button on the top right of Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening at this very moment. When you hit follow, leave a review or share an episode with a friend. It helps other people discover the show, keeps us going. As I like to point out each and every day, it expands our base. Yesterday, we talked about the question of whether or not our republic was secure, whether or not a president of the United States was trying to abuse power. And we talked about the vice president of the United States of America, who has suggested that judges are not allowed to check executive power. We talked about it, and then something happened. A federal judge in Rhode Island decided yesterday that the Trump administration had violated his order halting a sweeping federal funding freeze and ordered the government to, and I quote directly, immediately restore frozen funding. U.S. District Judge John J. McConnell handed down the order after the plaintiff in the case, a coalition of 22 states, said the government had not restored funding in several programs despite his January 31st order, temporarily halting the wide-ranging Office of Management and Budget directive that had caused chaos and confusion across the country and continues to cause chaos and confusion. McConnell wrote this in his decision. The states have presented evidence in their motion that the defendants, in some cases, have continued to improperly freeze federal funds and refuse to resume disbursement of appropriated federal funds, even though, my friends, this order was issued. It is, I hasten to point out, the first time President Donald Trump's second inauguration decisions and executive orders that a federal judge has accused the administration of defying a court order. Let me point out to you that Marbury versus Madison, a historic case from 1803, suggested and stated clearly and precisely a fundamental of federal law. Marbury versus Madison was clear. It said, judicial review, the Supreme Court, these actions can be viewed in the context of whether they violate the Constitution. And despite what Vice President Vance said, the courts rule. Now, let's be clear. What will happen now is that a decision will have to be made about whether or not this judicial decision stands. Ultimately, I believe that will go to the United States Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is the final arbiter. And let me point out to you, there are Supreme Court decisions with which I have agreed and Supreme Court decisions with which I have disagreed. We learned in Bush v. Gore that the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 vote, made a decision which many Americans felt was wrong. But we maintained belief in the legal system, and as Al Gore eloquently said in his concession statement, he may not agree, but the Supreme Court is the final authority. We are going to need a final word on this. The President of the United States is not above the law. Let me remind you of the wise words of Edward R. Murrow. The American system of government is revered by its people, admired by its foreign friends, respected by some of its opponents, and understood in its entirety by only a few specialists who, however, do not always agree about it. Edward R. Murrow believed in the system. So do I. And I believe that in the end, Donald Trump will be thwarted by his own arrogance of power. But let me suggest something to you, and I want you to think about it. Had Richard Nixon taken the position of President Trump and Vice President Vance, the course of history would have been very different. I pointed out to you that Nixon, had he defied the court, had the tapes not been released, would have survived, would have finished his term, and a great injustice would have been done to the American people. It is my hope, my sincere hope, that the court will act to determine the power of the President of the United States. That is my wish. I hope that is what happens. But I want to point out to you that under different circumstances, articles of impeachment would already have been drawn up. Oh, yes, by the Democrats, most assuredly. They would have said that what the president is doing and has done is unconstitutional. Now, I believe that at some point, the Democrats will do just that. It doesn't do any good, mind you, because the Republicans control the Senate and the House. There will be no impeachment proceeding, but the record should be clear. Let me point out to you that one of my avid listeners, a friend, and Rob, I'm speaking directly to you, has suggested that the power of the president should prevail, that executive power is what matters. And indeed, we have had a discussion about it, and he's recommended that I read several books about it, which I am going to do. But let's be clear. A president is not a king. And the courts, well, according to Marbury versus Madison, the courts have the right, indeed the obligation, to interpret the Constitution. And if the courts interpret the Constitution differently than the president, the final arbiter is the Supreme Court. And so, my friends, that's where we stand today. There are going to be a lot of things to look for in the days ahead, a lot of issues of concern. But I would have been remiss if I did not begin with the fact that a judge has once again taken a slap at what Donald Trump is trying to do unilaterally. This is an important moment in American history. I heard a debate yesterday on one of the networks about whether or not this was a constitutional crisis. And some said yes, some said no. I want to be crystal clear. If a president can act like a king, it is a constitutional crisis, and it needs to be resolved in the courts. And we need to debate it nationally, and I hope it will be. I hope that Democrats and Republicans alike will agree. One last thought. If the actions taken by President Trump had been taken by President Biden or by President Obama, you can be certain the Republicans would be up in arms. This is not an issue that should be decided on a partisan basis. It is an issue which should be decided on what's right for America. That's my thought this morning, and I hope you understand. It is not made lightly. Thanks for tuning into another episode of Around the Political World with John Rothman. Make sure to follow along and let me know your thoughts on the show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and sharing an episode with a friend or colleague so we can continue to grow and expand, which, of course, is our goal. You can interact with me on Facebook, on LinkedIn, or indeed by emailing me directly. May I also say, this show would not be possible without the wonderful work of Gogo Zoger, who is the producer of this podcast. Many thanks to all of you. I am John Rothman. You are listening to Around the Political World with John Rothman, and I will be back tomorrow.